All right, welcome back to the Foolproof Entertainment Network. I am the Geeky Coach, and today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about Star Trek Picard. So, Star Trek Picard, a new show here on CBS All Access. It is one of multiple Star Trek series that I think are kind of popping back up. Star Trek's starting to try to find its way back into the zeitgeist, and as a long-term Trekker, this is by far the best iteration of Star Trek we've gotten since Voyager. That's not any disrespect to the Chris Pine, J.J. Abrams Star Trek universe, but this is Star Trek to me. And when I think about the time I had growing up, watching episodes of Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, and I think Voyager had just started before my dad passed away, and just remembering watching these shows with him, and those are some of the things that that this definitely harkens back to, and I think that they touch on a lot of that kind of throughout this. And I just realized I dropped my notes, so I'm gonna grab my notes. So yeah, I think when we look at this, there's a lot in these first couple of episodes from Star Trek Picard, and I think as a longtime fan of the series, I was thrilled to see a lot of the callbacks to things that had happened, whether it was in the last Star Trek movie or the callbacks to things from say the last Next Generation episode, All Good Things. So I'm just going to kind of get into it and kind of wander through and run down my thoughts kind of as I watch the episode. So the fact that we start off with ends up being a dream sequence, but it's between Picard and Data. I think that really kind of ties it all back to the last time we saw these two characters in Star Trek Nemesis. There's even Blue Skies is playing in the background, which is what Data sang to Troy and Riker at their wedding. So I think that right there was enough to really just suck me back into, oh, this is definitely just a continuation of what we had already seen. So I think that was a big thing. And I think when he wakes up and we kind of get a life or a view in the day of the life of a retired Admiral Jean Luc Picard, it really ties into All Good Things. All Good Things was, for those that don't know, was the final episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. It was, I think, billed as a two-parter, but really it's just a 2 hour long episode. And what that future holds is kind of what you see come true here. And I think that was something that I really latched onto through this, especially having the memories of watching that final episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation with my dad. And so being able to see that all kind of come together and come full circle in this new iteration of Star Trek, I thought was really powerful. I think the other thing that when you start to kind of come into what's happening in the galaxy at large, what we learn is, hey, this takes place or jumps off from events that we saw in Star Trek 2009. So in Star Trek 2009, we learn about the supernova that's about to engulf Romulus, and that was really Ambassador Spock's kind of last act in that timeline. And we kind of see behind the scenes, and having read some of the comic books that led up to Star Trek 2009, was aware that Picard was leading some of the recovery efforts and trying to relocate those Romulans. I thought that was really well done, and I think that again it bridges the gap between what I think they're calling the Prime timeline and then the Kelvin timeline. So this still takes place in the Prime timeline, which honestly, I understand what they were trying to do with the reboot and making it flashier and honestly making it feel more like Star Wars than Star Trek, but I think that this is the first iteration of Star Trek that it feels like the old Star Trek. It feels like the Next Generation. It feels like Deep Space Nine. Now, I can go a little bit on the production value in terms of, are we looking at something that's super glossy? I think that you saw that turn towards glossy for Star Trek. Really, the last one or two Next Generation movies with Nemesis and Insurrection. But then, of course, as JJ's come on and they've kind of rebooted, and it just feels very glossy. This one has an edge of that, but it just for whatever reason, and I can't necessarily explain it, it feels more Star Trek to me. And again, I think that just harkens back to, the feelings that it gave me kind of growing up. Um, I think when you look at both the reboot Star Trek as well as the Star Trek Discovery, they just feel heavy. They feel highly overproduced, and that wasn't the point of Star Trek. Star Trek wasn't about the flashy visuals. It was about how does this become normal in our everyday lives. And I think that I think this show has done a better job of that than either Star Trek Discovery or the rebooted Star Trek. So, kind of continuing on, we're introduced to Daj and her boyfriend and whatever's going on there. The assassination attempts. I think what's interesting is they're referencing the Daystrom Institute. So again, I think that's something that gets brought up in every Star Trek series, and I think that hearing that come back in this one, again, just a great way to kind of tie everything around. I think that it was interesting to see that her being activated, and we'll get into this as you start to look at the second episode where the android F8 down on the Utopia Planitia shipyards, his activation sequence, and I wonder if there's tie-in there, but her activation is very much a triggered event, and it really becomes about self-preservation at that point. And I think that as we get in and we learn more about the Zhat Vash and how that ties into the Tal Shiar and the Romulans, I think that that's going to be something to kind of watch out as we go through this. Kind of looking through my notes. I like the fact that Picard, that they reference that Picard tried to take on that mission from Romulus and really rescuing the Romulans. I think it's very akin to what happened in Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country, where Spock, made sure that Starfleet and the Federation were looking out to rescue the Klingons. And so I think having that kind of balance, that on one hand, in the Kirk era, we have Kirk and Spock really kind of leaning in and rescuing the Klingons, and then and the Federation and Starfleet supporting that. But then on the other hand, 50 years later or 100 years later, whatever it is, I'm a geek about this stuff. I'm not going to get into specific timelines between the two, but the 100 years later, that they're not willing to do the same thing for the Romulans. And I think that's an interesting play. And honestly, I think it starts to look at some of the, I think it's reflective of kind of where we're at as a nation right now. We're becoming a little more isolationist and closing ranks, closing walls, building, watching the border, those kind of things. And it feels very similar to that, in the sense that the Federation and Starfleet have always been about these idealistic values and virtue, and then to see that the abandonment of those values and those virtues is actually what leads to Jean-Luc leaving Starfleet. And I think as a character moment, that makes a lot of sense for me. And I think that, dissimilar, or maybe similarly to the way that Luke Skywalker is portrayed in The Last Jedi, about how he kind of walked away and abandoned everyone, that kind of feels like what Picard does. And I think what makes it stick better is that we get a better explanation of what exactly happened. And I think that for Picard as a character, it makes sense that as the Federation is no longer willing to do what he considers to be the right thing, then he's no longer willing to be part of Starfleet and the Federation. And I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of his journey as a character. And I'm glad to kind of see us go through this. As just, again, this is just kind of spitballing off of notes, so I apologize if this kind of jumps around. This is the first time I'm doing a show like this, so we'll see how it goes, and we'll see if anybody likes it. So it makes sense that Picard would leave. I think what's interesting to see is that I think that continuing off those ideals of what Starfleet and the Federation stand for, I think if you go back to Deep Space Nine, you'll actually see a lot of the same kind of, you're starting to see Starfleet and the Federation, those values be eroded, both from without and within. I think that when you look at the toll of the war on Starfleet and Federation with the Dominion, I think that what you see carry over, and what I'm glad to see them kind of continuing on, is that there's some erosion there to, the idealistic Starfleet and Federation. And I think it's interesting that they brought in the concept that, yeah, we were willing to help the Romulans, but then there were 14 or 15 nations or whatever they're called in the United Federation of Planets that basically said, look, if you're going to help the Romulans, we're going to peace out. I thought that was, another interesting thing. I think what we start to get into from there, though, is the idea about the synthetics, and I'm going to cross a little bit between episode 1 and episode 2 here. The synthetic life form debate, I think, is important in our culture right now, because when we look at what's happening in the world and in the workforce, it's the idea of AI and automation, and those things are starting to become real things. Now, do I think that we're necessarily to true artificial intelligence at this point? No, it's machine learning, it's robotic process automation, those types of things. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to start to look at that, and then how can that be corrupted? And I wonder how they're going to tie in the Zhat Vash, and maybe it's Romulan culture as a whole. I'm curious to see how they tie in their loathing of synthetic life and artificial life to that incident. And I'm curious to see if we're going to get an explanation for why. Why are the Zhat Vash and Romulan society so anti-artificial intelligence? I wonder, and this was my speculation and my where I jumped to was, did the Romulans inadvertently create the Borg? And that's why they've got that loathing for technology, or did they go through something similar in their past, like what you look at from, say, the Mass Effect games, where the Reapers were built by organics, and eventually they saw themselves as superior to organics, and they would harvest life and kind of restart the cycle every 20 years or every 2,000 years, whatever the case is. So I think it'll be interesting to see how they get into some of those debates and how some of that kind of continues to go. Jumping into the Daj and Soji, I think it's interesting that they're playing down that daughter of Data angle, or where they're looking at them as daughters of Data. What I'm curious to see is, was part of Data's positronic neural net, was it harvested, and did that really lead to these characters being created, or were they able to do something or grab something from B4, even though they said that, Data attempted to download his neural net to B4 and it didn't really work. I wonder if it did, and Maddox just kind of found a way to hid that, or maybe it's something to do with LOL or lore. I mean, there were other androids related to Data that are out there, and so I think it'll be interesting to see kind of how they continue down that path. Data's journey, I think, is at the heart of a lot of the Star Trek: The Next Generation episodes, and definitely within the movies as well. I mean, really, between Nemesis and between Generations, where Data gets the emotion chip, and we follow his journey there in terms of learning to manage emotions. I think that this makes sense as a central tie-in for the series for Picard, and I think what we'll continue to see is a lot of reference to Data. I'm curious to see where they're going to go with the Borg cube, or the artifact as it's being called. Are the Romulans really just trying to profit off of it? That doesn't seem very Romulan, just to profit. That seems more like a Ferengi thing. Are they looking to revamp their technology and to find a new way to kind of put a foothold back in the galaxy and to have an advantage, a militaristic advantage, should they decide to kind of strike back at the Federation for abandoning them? I think it's interesting to say abandoning when those two factions had been pretty much mortal enemies for a long time, and I think that it'll be interesting to kind of see how that continues to play out. Let's see. Oh, another piece, episode 2, where the doctor shows up. Aromatic syndrome. That's another tie-in to the All Good Things episode. That's part of the reason why nobody believed Picard in that episode, that he was really transitioning through time, because he had been diagnosed with the aromatic, I think that's what it's called, the aromatic syndrome, that really starts to kind of eat away at his mind and those kinds of things. The other thing in episode 2 that I kind of found interesting was they talked about, they didn't wipe the data, they wiped the indexes. And for I thought that was a very intelligent way to get around some of that, and I thought that was just a clever comment in terms of, that's what I like about Star Trek versus Star Wars. I think it is supposed to be based in science. It is supposed to be based in real world science, and I think that that's something that makes sense to me. Um, yeah, I mean, really, that kind of wraps up kind of my initial thoughts. What were your thoughts? What was, if you're watching Star Trek Picard, what are the things there that make you, do you like it? Do you not? Is it something where is it just kind of us old heads that liked growing up on the next generation show that are really going to latch onto this? I think it's definitely the most Star Trek feeling thing that we've seen since Voyager and Nemesis back in the early 2000s. So I'm excited to kind of see where it goes from here. And this is just one fool's opinion, so feel free to shout me out in the comments, follow me on Twitter, and I usually try to give some sort of live reaction as I watch it on Thursday nights or whenever I can get to it with CBS. So um, thanks again for giving us a like, giving us a watch, and we'll try to get these going on Sundays. Sundays are probably the day where I'm going to be able to get up here and do 20-30 minutes just to kind of recap the show, and again, love to kind of get your opinions, your thoughts. That's one fool's opinion, and with that, we're out. Thanks.